So I have just come back from a fantastic trip to South Africa, and I was lucky enough to explore much of Kruger, both the north and the south, and then spend a little bit of time in KwaZulu-Natal at the end. One of the particular highlights for me, of which there were many, wasn't so much about particular game viewing or even a particular lodge, but it was a particular moment when I was out on a game drive and we pulled over for a sundowner, which is a tradition in South Africa. And it was one of those moments when it had been a great game drive. We'd seen, goodness me, leopards, we'd seen cheetah with cubs, we'd seen elephants, we'd seen rhino and a rhino cub. But we'd stopped on a kind of open riverbed and the sun was just setting. There was a range of mountains in the background and there was a huge storm brewing in the distance. There's a sliver of sunset, bright orange sunset. And we got out of the vehicle and they laid the drinks out for us. And I just remember the moment because it'd been a long time since I'd travelled and I remembered feeling incredibly lucky to be there. So one of the other highlights that I had on my recent trip to South Africa was the fact that I went during the start of the summer months, which is not normally somewhere that people tend to look to go on safari because the extra kind of rain does make the bush very green and in my mind beautiful. A lot of the flowers are starting to come out. It looks very fertile. It's not so arid. It's a little warmer. But one of the joys of traveling then is that it's a little less busy, but also a lot of the animals are having their babies because there's so much food and water around. And we were very lucky to come across a number of rhinos and their calves. So I think to see rhino anywhere is incredible, but to see this very tender kind of moment between the mother and her calf as they were walking around exploring, this very young calf of only about 2 or 3 months was taking its first kind of tentative steps out into the wilds was a very special kind of moment. Nearly all of the camps that I stayed in have an incredible approach to a more sustainable travel. And by that, I mean that they've been built along incredibly sensitive lines. Not just sort of solar panels, although pretty much everybody out there now is sort of either 100% solar or becoming 100% solar, but it's also their approach to the partnership trust that they have with a lot of the communities that work with them in terms of education, in terms of female empowerment, in terms of promoting female guides, which is something that's very close to Step's heart, but also the kind of provenance of the food that they have. I mean, there's some wonderful food and produce out in South Africa. So of course the food is great, but some camps even go as far as only sourcing wine that is manufactured along sustainable practices. So you can get incredibly granular, but I think the important thing to remember is that none of this is a compromise on comfort. And these camps were among some of the most stylish and comfortable camps that I stayed in with an incredibly light footprint. I was lucky enough to explore much of the Kruger, so the north and the south. And the reason I love the Kruger so much is that it's still the place to go really in South Africa for your big 5 safaris. The way that the Kruger works is that there's the main reserve, which is Africa's oldest and one of the biggest. That's very much open to the public. It is very popular with self-drivers. It's less regulated, so it can get very busy, and the roads there are tarred. The game's still very good, but it does detract from the wilderness when you're surrounded by lots of vehicles. What we tend to prefer are to use the private reserves that border, unfenced, the Kruger Park. And these are a collection of areas that are managed by often sort of philanthropic or groups of philanthropic lodges that have got together to conserve the wildlife and the land on which they're based. And it just gives you a much more rounded experience, a much better experience, because their approach to tourism is far more sustainable. And you notice that when you're there. It's far less busy, the game is healthy, as is the wildlife and the habitat. So you get a much more kind of personal, much more exclusive experience than that which you get in the reserve. KwaZulu-Natal is still fantastic for the big game, although to me, the beauty of it lied in the fact that there's so much more to see there because it's a slightly different habitat. It's a little bit more tropical, so you get a greater mix and certainly a greater range of diversity of wildlife there. You still get the big 5, but to me, the guides there are perhaps not so much focused on chasing down the big 5, and they're looking at the smaller flora and fauna, which you can often overlook in somewhere like the Kruger when you're chasing the big stuff. The landscape is slightly different. There's a number of mountain ranges there that lend the landscape just a bit more interest. So too the cultural element, with the Zulu there as well. That cultural side of things just gives the landscape a bit more personality than that which you find in Kruger, which is much more focused on the game. So it's a slightly more engaging, certainly more exotic destination, I'd say. What the guides in South Africa do, it really kind of bring the landscape alive in a way I've not seen in other areas before. And the reason for that is that a lot of the guides now in some of these newer camps they're much younger, they're very much more well-read, they are very much kind of on trend with what's happening in terms of new discoveries in animal behavior, which sounds very dry, but when you're out in the wilds, they can just really bring the place alive. An instance springs to mind when I was on a drive with one of the guides, and when the radio had called in, there'd been a cheetah sighting with some cubs, and which is fantastic. I had been very lucky earlier in the trip to see that, and my guide asked me whether I wanted to do that, and I did say no, because we wanted to explore kind of all the aspects of the wildlife that's out there, and we were rewarded by a couple of sightings of some honey badgers in broad daylight, which was fantastic. So it's not just about chasing down the big five, and I think that while South Africa does give that to you in droves, then some of the best guides really do kind of go on a slow safari and sort of draw back from that and just allow the wildlife to come to you, and you just see so much more if you let them take the lead on that.